There's always room for improvement. I'm thinking more about finding the right kind of crime fast enough. And I think in these forums, I think the bigger banks in Sweden has started to have a better conversation and can share off the record thoughts and ideas of how to actually work.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML, compliance and financial crime to the real world. I'm your host Fredrik, Head of Strategy and Business Development at Strise, and in this episode, we're asking what keeps compliance professionals up at night. We are recording this on the floor of Penningtvättsdagarna, Sweden's biggest event focused on professionals combating financial crime. So, what better time to look at these challenges that may have compliance professionals reaching for the stress ball. If you've ever been wide awake in the wee, small hours, thinking about data breaches, new policy procedures, or audits, this is the episode for you. In today's episode, we'll discuss what are the biggest challenges facing our industry in 2024, how can we combat these problems and find solutions going forward, and how do we better support those working hard to combat financial crime. To dive into this topic, I'm here with Åsa Birgersdotter, Head of Group AML and CFT at Handelsbanken. Åsa, thank you for joining us. Please tell our listeners about you, your background, and for our international listeners, a bit about Handelsbanken as well.
Grew up in Sweden, playing soccer or football for our UK listeners. I moved to the US to play soccer, but ended up studying as well, becoming in accounting. Later joining EY in New York, becoming a CPA in New York before moving back as an accountant in Sweden for EY. From that, I moved into Handelsbanken internal audit in 2017 approximately, because that's when I had my third child. That's how I remember it. I moved into financial crime prevention.
Amazing. And what about Handelsbanken?
Handelsbanken is a decentralized bank, which believes in that making decisions at the local level, because those are the people that are best aware of the problem. It's also a bank that has a principle called the church tower principle, where the branch office manager should be able to see all its customers from the top of the church tower. So it's a very geographical bank and local bank in that sense. And being part of the community will make you aware of your credit risks for your customers, because you hear the gossip, you know the customers. So this belief in decentralization and local decisions in combination with knowledge of the local community is what drives the credit granting process in the bank.
Super interesting with that perspective in today's day and age,
yes,
where most banks are getting more centralized and we see mergers happening and the local offices disappearing, unfortunately, in a lot of places as well. Let's dive straight into the conversation or the topic of today's conversation. So we're here at Penningtvättsdagarna, the biggest AML conference in Sweden. What do you think the mood of the industry on the floor at Penningtvättsdagarna is like right now for AML and compliance professionals?
I think the mood is good. Everyone is enjoying Penningtvättsdagarna. I think that everyone is very busy with a lot of things. Partly we have the move from EU to make regulations EU standards. Instead of having it incorporated into local law, we need to directly follow EU law in about 3 years. We have the AML regulation body that's going to be placed in Frankfurt finally, and they will be submitting a lot of standards. So trying to figure out what those requirements will be to prepare on time is, I think, on top of mind of a lot of people in that room right now.
Is that sort of the conversation that you're striking up with your industry peers around the water cooler in between talks here as well, in terms of the AML regulations probably coming into play in a few years, or new standards and procedures cross-border and so forth?
I think here it's actually been more focused on fighting real financial crime. So our day-to-day work of actually trying to prevent or mitigate those kinds of flows, rather than many discussions on upcoming regulations. I think making sure that you follow the regulations and laws has come to a point, at least for the bigger banks, where it's basic requirements. So this is just something you need to do. But actually finding the financial crime is still difficult because moduses change, everything is happening faster. For example, SEPA Instant, the instant payments that will go cross-border, you have 10 seconds, you cannot sanction screen them, but at the same time you need to be on top of all the risks. So those kinds of things are discussions that I had more about.
Interesting, and you feel your industry peers and yourselves share the same perspectives and worries about sort of what these instant cross-border payments, what type of consequences they'll have?
Yes, of course. Because it's very difficult to have real-time monitoring on an instant payment that's required to leave within 10 seconds. You need to be very sure that it's actually money laundering or fraud to stop it. Imagine all the payments going through the big banks all the time, and this is going to be 24/7. So how we must act to actually be compliant here and actually fighting financial crime pushes us to be better than we were.
Do you think venues such as Penningtvättsdagarna or AML conferences is a great venue for industry professionals to come together and be able to discuss these topics in a more sort of free-flowing conversation?
Yes, I think so. But I think that if we would like even more free discussions, maybe we should have something similar to the UK where you can discuss under the Chatham rules.
And for everyone who's not aware what the Chatham rules is, could you please give an explanation?
Well, pretty much you're not going to rephrase what anyone else says outside the room, and no media is allowed. Because, of course, when everything is public, it's going to be difficult to maybe discuss some of the more difficult topics. Do
you find that's one of the key challenges of this industry? I mean, within AML, within compliance, the ability to share certain worries and sort of limitations in potentially your own processes or your industry's processes that you're not able to share because you're afraid of sort of the backlash, because obviously there's a lot of publicly traded stocks and so forth, so saying publicly we have a problem with our processes could potentially have negative consequences on the bottom line or in terms of the public's trust and so forth.
Yes, I don't think any of the major banks have fundamental flaws in their compliance parts. There is always room for improvement. I'm thinking more about actually finding the right kind of crime fast enough. And I think in these forums, I think the bigger banks in Sweden has started to have a better conversation and can share off the record thoughts and ideas of how to actually work. But at Penningtvättsdagarna, I feel also somewhat a responsibility greater than only Handelsbanken to share some of the things with also smaller banks and other actors. We have cryptocurrency coming into regulation at the end of the year. And I'm sure there are many people that want to do a very good job. So if I can share some ideas and thoughts, this is better for the society as a whole. As it's not a trade secret for one single bank on how to fight financial crime. So this is the one point where we don't need to be that restrictive.
I think that's a brilliant perspective, and it's a good segue into today's main topic as well, which is what keeps compliance professionals up at night. So, Åsa, what keeps you up at night?
When you say compliance professionals, I'm thinking about worrying about complying with the law. But I'm not sure if that's the only thing you're thinking of.
No, to be fair, let me rephrase. What keeps financial crime fighters up at night?
Yes. So obviously there are two big things. I think we wouldn't be sitting here unless there was a regulation pushing all financial institutions into putting quite a lot of effort into this area. And with that comes a huge risk of a fine. That is always something that is considered from a compliance perspective, making sure that we follow the law. The law is risk-based, so there are many solutions. I don't see that it's one way to follow the law the way it's written, But there are many people that have very strong opinions about what is right, what is wrong, and how it should be done. And those opinions are not always the same, especially not over time. So it needs every financial institution needs to find its way to adapt the regulation to its organization. The other thing that's always stressing is actually making sure that you use the regulation that you're already required to do, because there are good things to actually fight financial crime. So what synergies can we find? Some things are very time-consuming and do not add extremely much to actually finding money laundering or tourist financing. Some of the KYC processes are perhaps to some extent not providing us with very good information, whereas some information is super relevant for the financial crime perspective.
Could you elaborate a bit on that point in terms of especially the points where you maybe think the data points or the information point doesn't necessarily transfer into good data points to assess risks? And on the other side of that, what data points do you think are crucial to assess risks? And maybe if you have some thoughts around sort of added data points that we maybe should also start looking into to add into the necessary regulations.
So for example, asking the customer, how much do you expect to make in payments next year? It's mostly difficult for most people to know their volumes. Of course, it could be similar to the prior year, but then you go and buy a house or you buy a car, or if it's a company, it could be starting up a new business. You can't even share that, and that comes up. So it's very difficult to expect individuals and companies to know their upcoming payment flows. And if you monitor against what the customer said, you will end up with a major amount of false positives with regards to money laundering, but you will get your KYC updated. Data points that are more relevant or that really help is, for example, looking into the ownership structure, looking into who is the beneficial owner, screening for adverse media, screening for sanctions, for example. I mean, those types of requirements in the regulations go one-to-one with actually understanding the financial crime risks. So it all depends on how you interpret what the requirements are and what data points you put in and what controls you add to those processes. But I think for individuals, it's easier to monitor, for example, transaction monitoring. It's easier to have an expectation on an individual's account rather than a company. And for companies, it's to a greater extent important to understand the people behind the company.
Do you think the rest of sort of the industry peers, and especially maybe your colleagues here and the ones you've struck up a chat with during the conference up until this point, would share that point of view?
Yes, I think a few would share it, yes.
Do you think there's any controversial opinions out and about in the conference room now that would be opposed to, I don't know, saying regulations should remove the on the self-declaration form, how much money should I transfer abroad, and rather make it more strict that you need adverse media screening to be included in all sort of your KYC and regulatory processes? So
the question is whether that should be regulated, the requirements of those kinds of...
So adverse media as an example, we know is kind of...
some people, yes. How can you... Because of course adverse media has to do with integrity, and then you get into GDPR and privacy. So that poses some challenges, definitely. I think it would be, of course, helpful if that it was regulated that you must always do that kind of search. At the same time, I am not a big fan of a huge amount of detailed regulation, because if it's too much and too detailed, then you lose sight of the forest. You have too many trees to see the forest, or the other way around.
Absolutely. No, Graham Barrow had a great talk yesterday morning about a lot of great things, but one of the key things he did mention, which I took away, was, are we measuring the right things? Yeah. Or is this a checkbox compliance exercise? Moving a bit on, we did catch up with Erik Blommé to get the regulator's view on the challenges as well. Erik Blommé is Director and Head of AML Supervision at Finansinspektionen, Sweden's government agency responsible for financial regulations. And on the floor of the conference, we had a chat with him, and this was what he had to say about the biggest challenges facing the industry today.
I think all organizations in the AML sphere right now are struggling with how to harness all this new technology that sits on our doorstep. And I think there are quite a lot of appealing and tech-driven solutions out there for transaction monitoring, for risk classification, and so on. However, as a supervisor, one of the biggest challenges that I see companies are struggling with right now is how to connect all of these sort of moving parts into one functioning whole, and sort of creating that red thread that you need to have all the way from analyzing risk into filing those STRs. So this is not so much a fintech thing as it is a question of governance, a strategy, and culture. And I think that those topics need to be part of the discussion as well, always.
Do you agree with Erik's point about the culture and strategy element and how important the governance piece is in all of this?
I couldn't agree more on the importance that it needs to be a whole. We work very much in our risk assessment to make a holistic control environment for the risks that we identify. So usually it's a combination of different kinds of things. For example, transaction monitor scenario together with an investigation effort, or an audit trigger together with an investigation effort. It could be a combination of gathering KYC with other things. It could be manual targeted controls. So we work very hard on the combination of the controls together should mitigate the risk sufficiently. But with that said, I think there are, in larger banks, a large amount of types of products, a large amount of types of customers, a large amount of exposure to different geographies. So the risk picture is quite complex. That makes it important to figure out where do you have the biggest risks and where do you put your focus on your risk mitigating actions, which is the whole basic idea of the risk assessment. On the other hand, you cannot disregard where you perhaps have low exposure or less risk. So even if we do not have, let's for argument's sake say we do not have a single trust as a customer, should we disregard the fact that trusts are high risk in our risk assessment completely? Well, it depends on how you look at it. And here you have different opinions. Some people say, yes, you don't even have a single trust. You don't need to talk about it at all. You don't need to have anything. On the other hand, the risk assessment should be the basis for your control environment. So if you don't mention the trust, and you don't educate about a trust, and no one knows about a trust, and then a trust comes along as a customer, how do you know that you actually handle this customer the right way? You don't. So you need to actually bring up, it's my opinion, even those things that are not your high exposure, to make sure that if it comes along, or even if you have small amounts of it, that you do have some kind of preparation. So if a trust comes in, you can have a pretty simple thing. Everyone must know if it's a trust, then it needs to be sent to a central department for check for KYC, let's say, for argument's sake. So you don't need to make it all that fancy or a lot of work, but you cannot disregard risks that you currently don't have or have small amounts of, just because you think it's not your biggest risk. On the other hand, you need to make sure that you have really good controls where you have large exposure, and making sure you really understand those risks in very much detail. And some people argue that you only need to assess risks where you have big exposure. And some people say the risk assessment should be shared with all the branch people or all the people in the entire organization. I mean, for a big group with thousands and thousands of employees, they will not read, I think, an entire risk assessment and understand what is my role in this. I think it's better to share the information from risk assessment in role-specific training that's targeted to that group so that they get use of that information. Also, if you have your risk assessment including inherent risk and residual risk, you will also expose where you have weaker controls. So if you share that with the entire group, then it can get out to the criminals. Yeah. So I don't think that's very smart either. But some people think it should be shared with everyone, so everyone in the company understands where you have risks and where you need improvements. People can have different opinions on the purpose of the business-wide risk assessment, how the information should be shared. I think there are a couple of purposes, especially the law says it should be the basis for creating your control environment. Keeping all that detailed information in a, for example, Word document or paper document, it's too much information. So you need somehow summarize that in a shorter version that you call your periodic risk assessment, that you somehow say this is per this date, this is our risk assessment. But then you need to keep a lot of information in separate, more detailed documents. It could be everything from model risk documentation to details on how you handle all your risks.
Can you keep a secret? This is Strictly Confidential, the podcast connecting AML, compliance, and financial crime to the real world is hosting a live on-stage recording in Sweden. We're recording The Laundry live on May 14th at Venue 81 in Stockholm, bringing you killer keynotes, expert guests, scorching hot takes, and networking, drinks, and pizza too. Follow the links in the show notes to get your free ticket to this event or to sign up to our live stream. And as always, stay vigilant out there.
We also talked with Erik Blommé regarding sort of the biggest potential solutions for the industry. Now, you alluded to a couple of solutions regarding especially risk assessments. And Erik Blommé also had a couple of great quotes on this.
Well, as a regulator, I am very much excited to see the new EU Anti-Money Laundering Authority enter the scene, the AMLA. As we all know, money laundering and terrorist financing are both cross-border risk, and they require cross-border solutions, and I think that AMLA will have a major part to play in this solution. I think they're in a good place to provide a sort of holistic view that we can't really do as separate supervisors with one country each under supervision. I think that AMLA has a much better starting point from that perspective. Well, from a short-term perspective, there is one really interesting legislative proposal that we have on the table right now, and that's aimed at certain cash-intensive sectors, and that has been a priority for us as an AML supervisor for a number of years, and is to this day as well. And if this is introduced into law, this proposal would definitely raise the threshold and sort of create stronger market entry controls for certain payment service providers and for currency exchangers. And I think that is a very welcome and well-targeted proposal. And I look forward to seeing what the end result will be here.
So do you share Erik's enthusiasm for the MLAA?
I share the enthusiasm with regards to actually some other industries getting under regulation. We also have Mika coming with the cryptocurrency regulation for AML purposes. So I think that's positive. I have some fear that they might put out a lot of standards which will require a lot of work to comply with, and that focus might switch to making sure we're compliant with all those requirements rather than focusing on new things happening in financial crime.
Because the AMLA, they will come with a set of new regulations there.
Yeah, the regulation is there, but they will set standards. They will set extra, what are you called, vägledning, guidance.
How do we ensure that the work that's being done on their end now aligns with the hard work that's gone into setting the standards that's already put into play, so that we try to better and evolve current standards rather than set up completely new standards, which would potentially lead to a lot of extra work and wouldn't necessarily be regional specific either, seeing as the AMLA will be a cross-border type of institution.
Yeah. I mean, of course, it's a benefit that we will all get the same in all countries, especially when we're a group, where some things differ then it will be more easy. But I think we need to be cautious on how we take us on these new requirements, because sometimes I think that the guidelines are not putting that much more requirements on us. It's just detailing a little bit what we're already doing. The work right now is that Finansinspektionen, of course, are providing input to AMLA as part of that, and we work via Bankföreningen, the Swedish Bankers Association, something like that, with input that way. But I think the EU is pretty big, so Sweden might not have that super much of a say.
And if you could ask a compliance genie, now looking into even further into solutions here, if you could ask a compliance genie for one wish that would solve a huge chunk of the compliance challenges or the financial crime challenges overnight, what would that one wish be?
Taking out expectations of asking the customer of their predicted cash or transaction flows. It doesn't say exactly like that in the law, but it's the general interpretation that that's needed to be done. So again, what is KYC? Because you can ask the customer on cash, on cross-border, on mobile payment, on domestic transfers, and we can ask for all the or insurance, all the expected payment flows. Taking away that expectation and monitoring against it would be solving, I think, a lot of work that is not super efficient to actually fighting financial crime.
Great, and if we look into that specific point, we briefly touched upon the point of like the checkbox compliance versus catching the real criminals, and the importance of striking a balance between the two to make sure we have processes, but that we never lose sight of what's the intended purpose, which is to eradicate financial crime. What's your thoughts on this and how we should move forward to strike a better balance that's potentially more targeted to actually solving the financial crime issue rather than just being compliant with regulations?
You could take two approaches. You could do the check-the-box compliance as small as possible, just to try to show that you're doing it, and then having a second process for actually finding financial crime. Or you can try to combine the risk-based approach into your risk assessment and making it a bigger function that works together. It is a little bit difficult because financial crime is very rapid, and making your BWRA is much slower.
And BWRA?
Business-wide risk assessment.
And what goes into the business-wide risk assessment?
You need to explain your products, your customers, modus operandi, what risk factors might you see, how do you mitigate those, how do you mitigate the actual financial crime. So it is a process for making the foundation of the work. But describing that on a large amount of products, customers and services is not done in a day, but the moduses change on a faster pace. So having a process where you're able to be very fast, but then on a periodic basis, collecting the information and updating your BWRA is crucial if you want to attempt to combine the two.
Absolutely. No, and I would guess in today's day and age where there's a multitude of channels which you could sell your financial products through, there's also a multitude of financial products. Yes. The complexity of exposure to these different type of products and making sure you have that overview for a bank such as Handelsbanken, as an example, is a very data heavy assignment. You have to triangulate a lot of information to actually be able to do the final analysis and say, this is where we have our exposure and this is how we mitigate it. Just getting that overview at the very beginning to do that, I would assume require a lot of hours.
Yes, exactly. So as you build your risk assessment over time, hopefully you get better processes of gathering that data, so it goes faster and faster. But that's key. You need good data and data analysts, and find as fast ways as possible to gather the data.
Perfect. All right, we're approaching the end of the episode, but we'll end the episode with a couple of quick fire questions also, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Let's go. Finish the sentence. The biggest challenge in compliance today is
aligning, I think, GDPR with AML.
What keeps you motivated when tackling these challenges?
The social impact on society.
What keeps compliance professionals up at night?
Thoughts about whether you have thought of it all.
And on that note, that brings this spin of the laundry to an end. Åsa, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find and connect with you?
Well, there's more information about Handelsbanken at our webpage, handelsbanken.se.
Money makes a world go round.
And thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed the episode, check out the back catalog and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. We'd also love for you to share the podcast on your social media channel. It really helps people find us. Got something you would like to share? You can comment on the Strise LinkedIn page, my LinkedIn page, or email laundry@strise.ai. Your host for this episode was me, Fredrik. Our producer was Matthew. Our engineers was Nicholas. The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud. Your data problem and your workflow problem now isn't your problem. Visit strise.ai for more information. See you next time.
Your money make a world go round.